She cried out in the holy house, and her cry was silenced with incense. In January of the year 1367, a girl died in the monastery of St. Agatha near Toulouse. Her name was not recorded in the Benedictine records or in the census of the Inquisition archives. In the chronicles, she was called "She Who Did Not Submit." According to a later entry by the abbot of the monastery, she resisted purification and thus deprived herself of the heavenly crown. 8 weeks earlier, by order of the spiritual council, an investigation into carnal deviations had begun in the convent. The reason for this was complaints from 2 senior nuns that some of the younger sisters wake up with unclean marks and reach out their hands to themselves in the dark. On the morning of November 13th, after Sunday service, 2 novices were summoned. They were not allowed to put on their tunics. They stood naked on the cold stone floor in front of an icon, and one of the brothers from the neighboring monastery, who had medical skills, had to determine to what extent the organ of virginity was capable of arousal. A testimony preserved in a copy of the Toulouse Palace archives reads, "The examination was carried out without touching the girls. A thin wooden stick made of cypress wood and carved in the shape of a crown was used. It was inserted between the folds, and the reaction of the flesh was observed. If the skin darkened and the lips swelled, it was considered that the devil had made his way inside the body." Both girls, aged 15 and 16, showed visible signs of the devil's touch. On that basis, the abbess appealed to the council with the words, "They must be flogged, for the organ of sin gives birth to fire in the thoughts." The procedure, officially called pacifying the female flesh, included washing the groin with vinegar and salt, anointing it with incense, followed by a sacred incision. The incision was made with a warm knife made of wrought iron, the tip of which was dipped in vinegar. The wounded area was tightly bandaged with a bandage soaked in powder made from dried lamb's blood and rosemary. One of the brothers who participated in the ritual wrote in a later report sent to the office of the Bishop of Montauban, "We tried to keep them from feeling pain as much as possible. We gave them opium in honey and thyme oil, but some did not fall asleep, especially the one who died later. She stared straight ahead and did not pray. After 3 days, both girls developed inflammation. One had a fever, pus, and a smell of rotting flesh. The other had convulsions and alternating loss of consciousness. The nuns wiped their groins daily with vinegar and salt, but the skin fell off in flakes. On the 3rd day, bleeding began. A local doctor, admitted at the insistence of one of the canons, said, "The cut was too deep and touched the base of the urethra. The blood is coming from inside. She needs to be laid on straw, otherwise the infection will spread higher." The abbess refused. "God's will has already been done. It is not worth interfering with what has been sanctified by blood," she said. The servants, who were assigned to clean the room, reported that after the 3rd week, the body of one of the girls smelled like rotten meat mixed with myrrh. Their beds were covered in pus, and the bandages stuck to their bodies so tightly that they could only be removed along with the skin. During the next bandage change, a piece of thigh was torn off the living girl. Under the bandage was an open black ulcer. At the beginning of the 4th week, the younger girl survived, but was left permanently immobile. The older girl died on the 6th day of December at 9 o'clock in the evening after her last seizure. Witnesses reported that she had been screaming in pain for the last 3 hours, muttering not prayers, but curses against the saints. After her death, her body was washed with cold water, and her groin was smeared with clay and wax. The funeral was held without bells. Her name was removed from the church register. Later, in his report, the Inquisitor de Chambre wrote, "Those who resist holiness do not die immediately. They rot piece by piece, so that all their flesh is consumed by damnation. 3 weeks later, the abbess received a new order to stop the practice of incision until further notice, as complaints had been received from 2 relatives of the deceased, one from La Rochelle and the other from Toulouse. But in the records of the convent of St. Agatha, there is no mention of female purification for the next 2 years, only an excerpt from the diary of one nun, written next to a reference to Easter in the year 1368. Brother Philip brought the knife again. I told him we wouldn't do it anymore, but he smiled and went to the refectory. In the spring of 1368, the bishop's office in Albi received sworn testimony in the form of a letter from a priest at the St. Mary's shelter on the outskirts of Carcassonne. It spoke of a woman with an empty face and abrasions on her thighs, who came at night, asked for water, but could not stand. Something rotten was oozing from her. He claimed that the nuns had driven her away without giving her shelter, and she had died against a wall in the rain. Upon examining the body, he saw a narrow, deep cut in the lower abdomen, crossed by stitches and soaked through with dirt. The identity of the woman was not established. The document was added to the internal archives and labeled as a possible victim of apostasy from church procedure. A month later, the Bishop of Toulouse demanded an internal investigation of the Order of Saint Benedict. The hearings confirmed that over the previous 18 months, 19 purifying incisions had been performed in 5 monasteries. In 8 cases, there was severe inflammation, and in 3, death. At the same time, no death was officially recognized as a result of the ritual. The main cause was concomitant blood poisoning caused by a decline in morality prior to the ritual. One of the monasteries, St. Bartholomew's in Narbonne, contained an archive of correspondence between the abbess and a representative of the Department of Medicine in Paris. He explicitly warned of the risk of sepsis and necrosis when using an iron knife, without heating and without prior washing with alcohol, but the abbess replied, "A hot knife leads to excitement. We need the body to be calm, not hot." The letters were subsequently confiscated and destroyed. Only excerpts from the interrogation of the copyist, found in the personal notebook of the court scribe Bertrand Dumanet, are known. They forbade any mention of blood, only humility achieved, everything else into the fire. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread in the surrounding villages. At fairs and near churches, people recounted stories of nuns who had had the darkness cut out of them, but it returned at night in their dreams. In some villages, mothers began to hide their daughters from the monastery collections, sending them to mills or marrying them off before the age of 14. One of the itinerant preachers near Tarn was beaten for preaching about the sanctity of bloodshed for chastity. He was tied to an aspen board and left at the edge of the forest at night. In the morning, he was found dead, his teeth knocked out and his mouth stuffed with straw. The palace chancellery began to suspect that the ritual of appeasement was not a purification, but a systematic elimination of women who did not submit to discipline. 2 informers from St. Paul's Monastery, both of low spiritual rank, reported that in fact cutting off was not used against those who sinned, but against those who expressed doubts about the postulates of the monastery's charter. In one case, it was applied to a girl suspected of reading folk poetry in her cell. In another, it was applied to a novice who asked permission to marry the son of a pharmacist. A handwritten report by the pharmacist, submitted to the Toulouse Chancellery, contains the following. "She was still fresh when I arrived, but she was no longer speaking. Her groin was smeared with some kind of fat, and her legs were tied. She was burning up. She was shaking so much that her teeth were chattering. There was a knife in the corner, and I saw traces of fabric and hair on it, but I was told not to touch anything, only to sprinkle the body with sage and pour vinegar over it. Some of the older nuns tried to stop the practice, but in one case, at the convent of St. Ursula, the Mother Superior, who suggested replacing the incision with periodic ablutions, disappeared. According to her assistant's notes, Mother Marian went to the outhouse in the evening, but did not return. Only her rope and part of her cap were found in the well where the ashes were dumped. Rumors of violent removals began to spread within the city walls. By order of the bishop, access to the convents was temporarily restricted. The gates to St. Agatha were locked with chains. Entry and exit were only permitted with the permission of the chancellery. Those who lived inside were required to bring daily reports on the condition of all the nuns. The documents were written under supervision. Those who wrote poorly or complained were transferred to isolation for prayerful immersion. The testimony of a maid who worked in the convent for a year stated, "One of the cells smelled of honey and meat. I found bandages and ashes on the bed, and in a bowl there was women's blood with rose petals. I was summoned to the Mother Superior, who said, 'You saw something that isn't there, forget it.' A week later, I was sent to another city, but I can't sleep anymore. I hear them at night." As of the fall of 1368, not a single victim had been officially recognized in the Diocese of Toulouse. But in a personal letter from Canon Robert de Montreal to Archbishop Béziers, there was a line: "Rot creeps through the wounds left by the knife, but the Church continues to say, 'This is the path to grace.'" In the winter of 1369, 8 cases of silencing were recorded at the monastery of St. Othon, north of Albi. This was the term used to describe the disappearance of novice nuns whose behavior did not conform to the norms of modesty. An archival inventory list compiled by Brother Alduin reports, "In January, 2 of the 8 returned, but they did not speak, did not eat, and soiled the straw beneath them. One died after 3 days without uttering a word. The other had pus on her feet and blackened flesh on her pubic area. They said, 'She'll live.'" The medical examination conducted by a barber surgeon summoned from Toulouse was recorded in a personal journal with the note, "Do not show to strangers." He wrote, "The incision was made roughly. The skin is tight, but inside there is pus and bruising. Some tissue may have been left inside. One of them shows signs of gangrene. They did not resist, did not even flinch, as if they had been burned from within. I suggested removing the affected areas, but the abbess said, 'Their bodies are beyond repair. Only their souls can be saved.'" All this was happening against the backdrop of new orders from Archbishop Béziers, who demanded tighter supervision of the moral steadfastness of the nuns amid rumors of night voices creeping through the walls. It was discovered that a wandering nun had infiltrated the convent of St. Clair in Nimes, posing as a messenger from the diocese. She lived among the sisters for 3 weeks before disappearing one night, leaving behind a scroll on which was written in shaky letters, "You are cutting what you do not understand, but one day it will return through your seams." 2 months later, there was an outbreak of disease in the convent. Of the 24 novices, 12 suffered from fever, internal bleeding, and pain in the groin. The notes of the monastery doctor, taken from a dismantled cupboard years later, said, "It is unclear where sin ends and decay begins. Some bellies are hardening like the skin of the dead. One of the girls bled black blood, and no one prayed. They just sang psalms as if it were a holiday. Meanwhile, the Carcassonne Palace Chancellery launched an investigation. 2 notaries sent to gather evidence. Both disappeared. Their horses returned without their saddlebags, and a parchment with smeared ink and blood-like stains was found by the river. After that, access to the monasteries was temporarily blocked. The guard assigned to St. John in Limousin reported, "At night, moans can be heard from outside, but during the day, everyone is listed as alive and praying. We ask for permission to bring in a doctor, but we are told that faith is the best medicine." In response to the increased control, some monasteries began internal purges. According to reports from internal correspondence of the chapter, the abbesses were advised to remove the names of disobedient nuns from the lists before the arrival of the inspectors. A letter from the convent of St. Catherine contained the following phrase: "She was weak and longed for the fleshly world. We freed her soul from doubt. Let her body rot in God's Son." During one of the court interrogations, a servant who served water in the refectory testified, "After supper, the senior sister told me to take away a basin of blood. I asked, 'Who is sick?' She replied, 'It's not an illness, it's the way.' When I looked into the cell, a girl was lying on the bed, whimpering like a puppy. Her legs were spread apart, and between them was a rag soaked through with black moisture. I ran out, they didn't let me back in." Gradually, fear spread among the clergy. One of the young canons, Jean de Rennes, refused to read the liturgy on the purification of the female principle, calling the practice blatant mutilation. He was arrested and imprisoned in the dungeon of the Abbey of Saint-Gilles. 9 days later, he died of fever. An autopsy revealed cuts on his chest and neck. The doctor who performed the autopsy wrote in his diary, "He died of gangrene, but the fear in his eyes died first." It was as if he already knew that there was no purification in pain, only silence in blood. By the spring of 1370, a secret order had spread throughout the dioceses. All monastic procedures involving blood are to be considered an internal matter of the order. Interference by lay people will be punished by excommunication. This allowed the nuns to continue their rituals, even intensifying them. Secret underground rooms were discovered in some monasteries, containing wooden crosses with clamps, knives, bowls of charcoal, and bandages. The walls were covered with prayers, scratched with fingernails. Women continued to disappear, some with the silent approval of their families, others were kidnapped. A report from the mayor of the village of St. Leu stated, "On the 15th, the miller's daughter disappeared. She was seen by the road in the evening, but in the morning there was no sign of her. 3 days later, her dress was found by the monastery wall. It was wet and smelled of vinegar." In the spring of 1371, a secret crypt was discovered behind an icon on the wall of the Abbey of Saint-Modeste in Rouen. Inside were 8 bodies, all female. Most had bandages between their legs, soaked in dried blood, pus, and a foul odor. Some limbs were clamped in wooden restraints, and on the wall was an inscription, "Cut out doubt, and you will come closer to God." The report of the doctor Robert de Comignac, who was called to examine the remains, noted, "The incisions were made ineptly, the edges were not treated. The tissues of the deceased had begun to rot while they were still alive. Death probably occurred 2 or 3 days after the intervention, with fever, internal inflammation, and extensive ulcers. One of the women died while pregnant. The results of the examination were ordered to be sealed, and the crypt itself was to be walled up. By order of the Archbishop, the case is to be considered closed, for the dead are silent and the living have repented. The doctor was accused of insulting the memory of virgins, and 3 weeks later he was found in a river with his throat cut. The fingers of his right hand were missing. Meanwhile, the rhetoric of voluntary purification intensified in the monasteries. Records of sermons recorded at a meeting of bishops in Poitiers reported, "She who feels desire has already sinned. She who cuts herself in the name of purity is holy. Female flesh must be silent. Any moisture is a sin, any sweetness is from the devil. Let the knife purify those whose hearts cannot pray without trembling in their stomachs." Some abbesses asked for permission to extend the practice to girls from the nobility, suspecting them of softness and sinful blood. In the testimony of Marguerite de Solesmes, recorded in 1372 after her escape, it is stated, "They gave me wine mixed with herbs to drink, then tied me up and read prayers. Then there were moans and screams. First someone else's, then mine. I felt something cutting inside me, then pulling. I lost consciousness. When I came to, I was lying in a pool of blood. The abbess said, 'You are now purified. The pain means that your sin was alive.' I did not feel holy, only empty. A week later, I ran away. To this day, I can still hear the rustling of rags at night. Cases of hysteria became more frequent throughout the country. Girls from poor families, afraid of being sent to convents, hid in basements. Parents kept quiet about their disappearance. At the same time, surveillance intensified. Collectors began to appear in cities to gather evidence of suspicious births, bloodstains, and excessive joy among girls. All this was called the search for carnal obsession. In some cities, women were interrogated for laughing in the street. Several were publicly branded and sent to houses of purification. From internal correspondence between the chapters of Saint-Malo and the Council of Lyon, if the trend toward voluntary renunciation of the body continues, we will not have a single woman left who is suitable for marriage. Fear does not give birth to faith. It gives birth to silence. But can silence give birth to salvation? At the same time, the papal curia, concerned by the rumors, sent an embassy commission with the task of ascertaining the level of discipline and faith in women's convents in France. The commission visited 15 convents. In 12 of them, an atmosphere of tense, silent submission was noted. Only in 2 did the examination of the bodies cause concern. The report on behalf of the envoy Romuald de Salvo stated, "One of the nuns burst into tears during the examination. Under her belt was a festering scar. There were marks on her thighs where she had been restrained. When we tried to talk to her separately, we were told she has taken a vow of silence. Her tongue had been partially cut out. We did not continue the conversation." At that moment, the church was on the brink. On the one hand, public discontent was growing. People whispered in the markets, accused priests, and burned candles at the walls of the monastery in memory of the silenced daughters. On the other hand, disputes began within the hierarchy itself. Some young cardinals demanded an investigation. One of them, Francesco Torelli, proposed convening a special council. 2 months later, he fell ill. The diagnosis was fever. 5 days later, he died. An autopsy revealed internal bleeding and ulcers in the intestines. The doctor who performed the examination was found dead the next day. With the approach of cold weather, more and more women began to disappear. Some convents did not open their gates at all. A report from the Orleans Guard states, "A woman approached the gate. She screamed for her daughter to be returned. She was dragged away. When we tried to intervene, the abbess said that the girl had already died of spiritual fever." In the fall of 1374, the abbess of the Abbey of Saint Modesta, Mother Ursula de Clare, stopped attending Mass. For several weeks, no one saw her leave her quarters. The The guards protecting the north wing were doubled. A report from Ambroise, a servant in the monastery kitchen, states, "I was not allowed to go beyond the third staircase. The smell of rotting flesh came from inside. It smelled like death. Sometimes there were moans, sometimes there were screams, as if she were tearing something out of herself." When the Bishop of Rouen, concerned by the silence, sent a surgeon to examine her, Mother Ursula was found lying in her own bed, emaciated and unconscious. There were open sores on her thighs. Between her legs was blackened cloth, stuck together with pus and dried blood. On the sheets was a crumpled note, with the words, "I could not expel the flesh, only the pain." The doctor left a written report describing the condition. "The sores are infected. The tissue is dead. She has developed gangrene in the perineum. Her temperature is high and she is having difficulty breathing. She is in agony." That same evening, he was dismissed. The report was burned. 3 days later, Mother Ursula died. According to the nuns, she did not speak for the last 24 hours. She just pulled at the blanket and gasped for air. The body was taken out at night. Part of the door, jambs on the inside, had to be cut off. The skin had begun to decompose while she was still alive, and the tissue had stuck to the boards. It was not possible to embalm her. The local doctor refused. The smell of decomposition was so pungent that the coffin was doused with wine vinegar and wrapped in tarred cloth. The burial was held in private. There was no mass, no bells, no name on the cross. However, the death of the abbess was not the end. It was the beginning of the collapse. A month later, representatives of the chapter arrived at the abbey intending to investigate the internal order. 38 documented cases of mutilation of girls under the age of 20 were discovered. 6 of these cases were fatal. The testimony recorded in the investigation report reads, "I didn't want to, but she said, 'The more blood, the purer the soul.' We believed her. Then came the fever. Then the pain. Then darkness." Other survivors' statements. "We prayed while they cut us. The prayers were supposed to drown out the screams. They told us that this was how they treated holy virgins. Some died on the same day. They were called the chosen ones. After the scandal became public, the Roman Curia decided to abolish the abbey. All the nuns were transferred to other convents. Some were forbidden to serve. 2 disappeared. Only copies of the orders have survived in the archives. Considering the practice destructive to the soul, the body, and the general order, it is hereby dissolved, abolished, and silenced." Nevertheless, rumors spread beyond the walls of the church. In Lyon, Avignon, and Toulouse, popular gatherings began. People lit candles at cathedrals named after women. Some wrote in charcoal on the walls, "God did not ask for blood." Preachers who had renounced their faith appeared in the cities, accusing the church of massacre in the name of fear. One of them, Geoffroy of Blois, was hanged a week after his first sermon. Traces of torture were found on his body. A report by the city guard stated, "The flesh has been removed from his chest, his mouth has been sewn shut, and the word 'silence' has been carved into his forehead." Later, a commission was convened in Paris, which declared that such practices were not systematic and were the result of local fanaticism. However, internal records from the Cathedral of Saint-Denis testified, "We knew, but we kept silent, because it brought peace, because it was easier than facing our desires." A year later, in 1375, a decree was issued prohibiting any surgical interventions in women's monasteries without the written permission of the bishop. However, in reality, no control was ever established. In remote monasteries, women continued to disappear. The evidence ceased. The flesh remained silent. In the treatise On the Limits of Holiness, written later by an anonymous monk, it was said, They cut out what they feared, and they did not fear the body. They feared lust, they feared women, they feared memory. Thus ended the story of the one who wanted to banish sin with a knife. And it gave rise to a great silence in which hundreds of bodies rotted without a name, in the name of purity.